Before the doors close and the truth goes silent, subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Because once you step inside Angola Prison's death row, not every story lets you walk back out. The night shift at Angola Prison moved slower than time itself. The corridors of death row were washed in a dull blue glow, fluorescent lights humming above concrete that had absorbed decades of footsteps, shouts, and whispered regrets. Steel doors lined the tier like sealed mouths, each one holding a man condemned by the state, each marked by scratches, dents, and the faint outlines of lives that had narrowed to a single cell. The air smelled of disinfectant and rusted metal, with an undercurrent of something older, fear, maybe, or resignation. Guards walked their rounds with measured steps, boots echoing softly, hands resting near radios that never truly went silent. In cell D-17, an inmate sat motionless on his bunk. His arms were inked from wrist to shoulder, crude tattoos layered over one another like a timeline of bad decisions. Names crossed out, symbols faded, numbers that meant something only to him. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor as the sounds of the prison drifted through the bars. A cough from down the tier, a distant clang of gates, the low murmur of prison guards exchanging routine updates. This was a high-security prison where routine was everything, where deviation meant danger. The stillness shattered when a guard froze mid-step. "Hold up," he muttered into his radio, voice tight. A cell 2 doors down stood open. That wasn't supposed to happen. Within seconds, the tier shifted from silence to controlled chaos. Prison guards moved fast but quiet, training overriding panic as they signaled for a lockdown. Red lights flickered to life at the far end of the corridor, alarms muted but unmistakable. Somewhere deeper in the facility, heavy steel gates slammed shut, sealing off sections of the prison like a maze rearranging itself. Angola Prison had protocols for everything: riots, fires, medical emergencies, but an unsecured death row cell triggered a different kind of response. This was where the state kept men it never intended to release. The inmate assigned to the open cell was known among guards as quiet, cooperative, almost invisible. His body, like the others, was mapped in tattoos, dark lines etched into pale skin, but his behavior had never raised flags. No write-ups, no recent confrontations, just another man waiting for the calendar to run out. Now his absence echoed louder than any riot ever could. Guards swept the tier with flashlights cutting through shadows, checking corners, counting bodies. Inmates with tattooed faces and hands pressed themselves against bars, some pretending to sleep, others watching with open curiosity. On death row, information was currency, and tension spread faster than any rumor. Cellblock tension thickened the air as voices rose and then dropped again. Inmates sensing that something was wrong, but not yet knowing how wrong. A lieutenant arrived, jaw set, eyes scanning the corridor. "Confirm count," he ordered. No movement outside assigned zones. The count came back short. No alarms had sounded beyond the initial lockdown. No cameras showed a clear escape. Prison surveillance feeds were looping clean, uninterrupted footage of empty hallways and closed doors. It was as if the prison itself had missed something, or someone had helped it look the other way. Investigators were called in before dawn. By the time the sun rose over the Louisiana fields beyond the razor wire, Angola Prison was locked tighter than it had been in years. Yard access was canceled. Meals were delivered cell by cell. Inmates with tattooed arms extended their trays through slots without a word, eyes tracking every movement. Solitary confinement units were prepped, just in case. This wasn't punishment yet, it was containment. The missing inmate hadn't vanished into thin air. That much was certain. In a place built to prevent jail escape attempts, disappearance suggested something far more dangerous: planning. As the internal investigation began, guards retraced steps from the previous evening. Shift logs were checked, radios replayed. Surveillance timelines were scrutinized frame by frame. The prison documentary version of events would later describe it as a systematic review, but inside those walls, it felt like a hunt, quiet, methodical, and relentless. Inmates were questioned one by one. Tattooed hands rested on steel as voices answered carefully. On death row, saying too much could be just as deadly as saying nothing at all. One man, his neck wrapped in faded ink, claimed he'd heard scraping sounds after lights out. Another swore he'd seen a shadow pass beneath the lights during count. None of it lined up. Criminal psychology taught investigators that truth inside a prison rarely came straight. It bent under pressure, fear, and loyalty. The missing inmate's cell was sealed off. Inside, investigators found a space stripped bare of personal items. No letters, no commissary. Even the crude drawings that usually decorated death row walls were gone. It looked less like abandonment and more like preparation. The mattress had been shifted. The concrete beneath showed faint scuff marks, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor. A guard crouched, running a gloved hand along the base of the wall. His flashlight caught something unusual, a hairline crack where concrete met steel. Too clean, too deliberate. "Get maintenance down here," he said quietly. Elsewhere in the prison, tension escalated. Inmates with tattooed faces began banging on doors, testing reactions. Prison gangs, usually restrained on death row, stirred behind locked bars, sensing opportunity in disorder. Guards doubled up on patrols. Radios crackled constantly. Every corner felt watched, every shadow suspect. This was a USA prison story unfolding in real time, and no one knew how deep it went. Maintenance arrived with tools and caution. They worked silently, aware that every move was being recorded, every second logged. When the first section of concrete gave way, the room went still. Behind the wall was a cavity, narrow, dark, and extending downward. A tunnel, not a crude hole dug in desperation, but a reinforced passage sloping beneath the cell, disappearing into darkness. Air moved through it, cool and deliberate, carrying the unmistakable message that this wasn't the work of a single night. This was time, patience, and intent carved into stone. The lieutenant stared at the opening, jaw tightening. A real prison escape from death row wasn't just rare, it was almost unthinkable. And yet, here it was, breathing quietly beneath Angola Prison. As flashlights traced the tunnel's edges, something else came into view, lodged just inside the entrance. A scrap of fabric, stained and torn, marked with ink symbols familiar to anyone who'd worked these tiers long enough. It wasn't just evidence of escape. It was a message. And as investigators realized what those markings meant, one truth settled heavily over the cell block. This wasn't over, and whoever was involved hadn't acted alone. The discovery of the tunnel sent a shockwave through Angola Prison. As dawn broke, the cell block transformed into a fortress of caution and suspicion. Guards, with arms crossed and hands hovering near their radios, patrolled at a slower, more deliberate pace. Their eyes scanned every inmate, every tattoo, as if each inked mark held a story of complicity or betrayal. The lieutenant who first found the cavity in cell D17's wall quickly convened a briefing. Surveillance teams, investigators, and senior guards crammed into the room, the air thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee and steel. Lockdown protocols were now absolute. No yard time, no visits, no exceptions. The investigation started with the most obvious question: where was the missing inmate? Every prisoner on death row was accounted for, yet the mystery of the tunnel loomed like a storm cloud over the entire facility. Interviews began immediately. Inmates were called from their cells one by one. As their tattooed arms and hands slid through the small slot openings to sign log sheets, their voices were measured, cautious. Everyone knew a single misstep, a single wrong word, could trigger retaliation from either the guards or fellow prisoners. Each interview was like navigating a minefield. Questions about the missing inmate, the tunnel, and any potential collaborators were met with a wall of silence, clever misdirection, or thinly veiled warnings. Detectives meticulously documented every inconsistency. One inmate claimed he heard scraping and whispering in the dead of night, while another swore he was fast asleep during the entire shift. Every small detail mattered. The way an inmate hesitated before answering could signal guilt, or it could just be fear. Criminal psychology was critical here. Reading these subtle, nonverbal cues could be the key to determining if someone was hiding knowledge or simply protecting themselves in the high-stakes world of Angola's death row. Meanwhile, investigators re-examined surveillance footage from the night of the discovery. They started noticing minor anomalies that had been overlooked before, shadows moving in patterns that didn't match the guard rotations, strange blind spots in the camera feeds, and unusual interactions between certain tattooed inmates who rarely even acknowledged each other. The footage hinted at a coordinated effort, but the evidence was still purely circumstantial. The prison guards themselves were questioned rigorously. Each step of their night shift was reconstructed, minute by minute, in a painstaking search for lapses in protocol or, worse, direct complicity. Every answer, every slight hesitation, was logged and cross-checked against their colleagues' statements. Within the cell block, the complex dynamics between inmates began to surface. Tattoos that once seemed like random, decorative ink now spoke of alliances, gang affiliations, and deep-seated rivalries. Investigators started approaching prisoners with elaborate tattoos depicting specific symbols or dates, trying to decipher their hidden meanings. They documented every subtle indicator of social hierarchy: who ate together, who was seen passing notes, who lingered a little too long near the sealed-off cell. Even in a maximum security environment, social structures dictate power and the flow of information. Understanding these relationships was crucial. Without it, the tunnel would remain an isolated, unsolvable mystery. Then came a breakthrough. A veteran guard, reviewing old paperwork, noticed a strange pattern in commissary requests. Over the past month, certain inmates had requested unusually specific items, tools and materials that, on their own, seemed harmless. But when viewed in the context of the tunnel's construction, they suggested a level of preparation and coordination that was deeply alarming. Investigators connected the dots. These requests had been overlooked in the mountain of routine paperwork, but now they painted a clear picture of intent, an intent that stretched far beyond a single, desperate inmate. Inside the prison, anxiety escalated. The missing inmate's cell remained sealed, cordoned off with crime scene tape. In the corners of the cell block, other prisoners whispered, their eyes darting nervously toward the guards and the ever-present surveillance cameras. The prison gangs, sensing the rising tension, began to shift their own positions, subtly testing boundaries without any overt confrontation. The lieutenant observed these new patterns of avoidance, noticing which inmates refused to make eye contact with each other, and which ones seemed drawn to the now-sealed entrance to the tunnel. Every small gesture had become a potential clue in a prison-wide puzzle. One of the most significant discoveries came during a tense inmate interrogation. A man with a dense sleeve of tattoos covering his forearms, neck, and chest revealed a fragment of information, almost as if by accident. He casually mentioned seeing another inmate lingering near cell D-17 late one night, carrying a bag of tools that had no business being there. His tone was dismissive, but the investigators caught the slip. It was the first solid hint at collaboration. Follow-up interviews intensified, with guards and investigators cross-referencing every alibi, every interaction, trying to corroborate the new lead. At the same time, the internal politics of the prison complicated the investigation. Officers who had served for decades at Angola had their own personal loyalties and grudges. Some feared retribution from inmates if they revealed too much. Others worried about administrative backlash for failing to detect the tunnel sooner. The investigators had to navigate a delicate balance. They had to push the guards for honesty while managing their fears, enforce protocol without creating widespread panic among the inmates, and maintain an atmosphere of absolute control while the shadow of the escape attempt loomed over every corner of the prison. Slowly, the clues began to converge. Security logs showed unusual door activity late at night. Tools were traced back to unlocked storage areas, and multiple tattooed inmates were linked by a series of subtle interactions observed across different tiers of the cell block. Each new discovery added another layer of complexity. The tunnel was real, but the extent of its planning involved multiple players, working together in secret. This wasn't just an isolated crime. It was a coordinated effort, driven by desperation, incredible cunning, and the unrelenting pressure of life on death row. The chapter closed with a chilling revelation. A coded message, etched into the concrete wall near the tunnel's entrance, had previously been dismissed as a meaningless scratch. But upon closer inspection, it revealed a hidden system of communication used among the inmates. It was the final confirmation that the missing prisoner had not acted alone. More than that, it implied that the investigation was about to uncover a network of complicity that reached far deeper into the walls of Angola Prison than anyone had ever imagined. With that discovery, the investigators realized the danger wasn't contained to a single cell or a single tier. It threaded through the entire prison like a hidden current, just waiting for the right moment to resurface. The internal investigation had only just begun, and the real story of desperation, cunning, and survival was about to unfold. The pressure inside Angola prison intensified the moment investigators confirmed the coded markings were more than idle scratches. Word traveled faster than any official announcement ever could. Tattooed inmates felt it first, a subtle shift in the air, a tightening of shoulders, a new caution in the way eyes met, and then quickly turned away. On death row, fear didn't announce itself loudly. It settled in quietly, creeping through cell blocks and into routines that had once felt unbreakable. Prison lockdown protocols deepened. Guards doubled their rotations, now moving in pairs, radios clipped high, voices low and controlled. Every door opening echoed longer than usual. Surveillance cameras were adjusted, angles widened, blind spots narrowed. Yet even in a high-security prison built to eliminate uncertainty, something unseen still moved beneath the surface. The tunnel had proven that certainty itself was an illusion. Investigators focused on the inmates who had spoken too carefully during questioning. One man, his scalp and hands covered in faded tattoos earned over decades behind bars, had suddenly stopped engaging altogether. He refused meals. He refused eye contact. His silence was louder than any confession. Another inmate, younger but already marked from collarbone to wrist with fresh ink, began pacing his cell at night, muttering to himself, setting off motion sensors repeatedly. Guards logged it as agitation, but investigators recognized it as pressure cracking through the faults of criminal psychology. Then, evidence began to disappear. A tool inventory went missing from a maintenance storage room. No forced entry, no broken seals. Surveillance footage for a critical 15-minute window glitched, replaying the same empty corridor on a loop. Prison guards swore the system had never malfunctioned before. Someone had interfered, either through negligence or design. That possibility cast a long, dark shadow over every officer on duty. Trust became currency, and it was in desperately short supply. Inmate interactions grew sharper, more brittle. Tattooed men who once nodded in passing now avoided one another entirely. Prison gangs, normally dormant on death row, began signaling quietly, coded hand gestures, brief exchanges during meal delivery, eyes lingering just long enough to send a clear message. The tension in the cell blocks climbed with each passing hour. Guards reported an increase in banging, shouted threats quickly swallowed by an eerie silence, and one near altercation that was broken up before fists could even fly. The entire prison felt coiled, wound tight, ready to snap at any moment. The investigation then took a deeply personal turn. A senior correctional officer, 20 years on the job, respected, unflinching, was found visibly shaken during an early morning round. He claimed he'd received a message, slipped silently under the control room door. There were no names, no threats spelled out plainly, just a drawing, sketched in dark, heavy ink, matching the same coded symbols found near the tunnel entrance. The implication was chillingly clear. The network knew who was asking questions, and it could reach far beyond the bars. Administration tightened the perimeter immediately. Internal affairs stepped in. Every guard's movements were now tracked as closely as the inmates. Some officers resented the scrutiny, others welcomed it, but all of them understood the stakes. If the conspiracy extended beyond the cell block, then Angola prison wasn't just facing an escape attempt. It was confronting a fundamental breach of its own authority. Inmate interrogation resumed under heavier security. One man, his chest and neck layered with old gang tattoos, softened by age, finally broke. He didn't offer a confession, but something far more valuable: fear. He spoke of whispered promises passed through vents, of hopes sold like contraband in the dead of night. He described a plan built slowly, piece by piece, fueled by men who believed regret had nothing left to take from them. The tunnel, he said, wasn't just an exit. It was a statement, proof that control could always be challenged. As his statement was being recorded, alarms suddenly sounded elsewhere in the facility. A disturbance erupted 2 tiers down, doors rattling, voices rising in a unified, rhythmic roar. Guards moved fast, sealing sections, pushing inmates back, restoring order before it could bloom into a full-scale riot. But the timing was impossible to ignore. It felt coordinated, a planned distraction designed to pull attention away from something else, something happening in the chaos. When calm returned, investigators discovered what had changed. One inmate, a man with heavily tattooed arms, who had been under guard and previously considered peripheral to the investigation, had been moved. Not escaped, not released, transferred within the prison system without proper authorization. The paperwork was flawless. Too flawless. Someone had greased the machinery of the institution just enough to shift a critical piece on the board. The realization hit hard and cold. The conspiracy was still active, still adaptive, and now willing to endanger anyone who stood too close to the truth. As night fell over Angola Prison, the lights dimmed and the corridors fell quiet again, but no one mistook it for peace. Somewhere behind steel doors and concrete walls, plans were still breathing. And the investigators understood now that the danger wasn't just about who had tried to escape. It was about who was still trying, and what they were willing to risk before this was all over. The fourth day of lockdown over Angola Prison felt like a lifetime. Exhaustion was a heavy blanket draped over everyone. Guards walked the corridors, their eyes hollow, their jaws tight. Their movements were automatic, a mix of instinct and protocol. The prison itself had changed. It wasn't a place of containment anymore. It was a pressure cooker, ready to blow. Every little sound, every clang of a door, every footstep, echoed with meaning. Every moment of silence felt intentional, like the deep breath before a scream. The investigation had reached a dangerous point, a narrow ridge where finding the truth meant walking hand in hand with peril. Investigators laid out everything they had. Surveillance footage with strange glitches, coded symbols scrawled on walls, whispers and testimonies from inmates. And that one unauthorized transfer, a piece of paper that should have never been signed. As they stared at the evidence board, patterns started to click into place. The tunnel wasn't just a physical hole in the ground. It was the end result of a massive psychological game, a complex operation that played on the deepest human emotions: fear, hope, and regret. It targeted a population of men who believed they had nothing left to lose. This is where criminal psychology became the key. The investigators had a breakthrough. This whole elaborate plan wasn't about a desperate bid for freedom. It was about control. The inmates digging that tunnel, the ones passing messages, they didn't actually think they'd be walking out into the sunshine. What they wanted was leverage. They wanted to prove that even in this place, a place designed to crush them, they could still manipulate the system. On death row, power isn't about money or influence. It's about attention. It's about proving you can still disrupt the machine that's trying to erase your very existence. With this new understanding, their focus snapped to one man, the missing inmate from cell D17. His tattoos, initially just logged as routine identifiers, suddenly became a roadmap. Symbols inked on his forearms matched the mysterious codes found on the walls. Dates tattooed on his ribs lined up perfectly with key phases of the tunnel's construction. What looked like personal art was actually a blueprint, hidden in plain sight. A secret language readable only to the initiated. The investigators started re-interviewing everyone connected to him. Slowly, like peeling an onion, the layers of the conspiracy came away. One inmate, his hands trembling, admitted to passing tools hidden in cleaning supplies. Another confessed to sending messages through the ventilation system, using a secret code of coughs and taps, all timed to the rhythm of the guards' patrols. None of them were part of an escape plan for themselves. Their reward wasn't freedom. It was something far more intoxicating: belief. The belief that death row wasn't the end. It wasn't the place where your will to act finally dies. Inside the cell blocks, the pressure was unbearable. It had reached its breaking point. Solitary confinement units, the infamous hole, filled up fast. Suspects were isolated, partly for interrogation, but also for their own safety. In the dead silence of those cells, stripped of all routine and human contact, the inmates started to crack. Guards reported hearing men pacing all night, whispering prayers to a god they weren't sure was listening. They heard sudden, explosive outbursts of rage, followed by the haunting sound of quiet sobbing. In that isolation, regret came to the surface, raw and unfiltered. It was more honest there than in any interrogation room, and it was suffocating. The unauthorized transfer finally broke open under intense scrutiny. It wasn't some grand conspiracy or a case of a guard on the take. It was something much more mundane, and in a way, much more terrifying. A mid-level administrator, drowning in decades of paperwork, had signed off on it. He hadn't recognized the inmate's name or the significance. It wasn't corruption. It was complacency. The system hadn't been infiltrated by some evil genius. It had been slowly eroded by the mind-numbing monotony of routine. That single realization hit the investigators harder than any discovery of betrayal. Angola hadn't been beaten by a brilliant plan. It had been outsmarted by sheer, grinding patience. Then, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, scanning the earth beneath the cell block. The scans revealed the tunnel's true purpose. It didn't snake its way out towards the outer perimeter fence. It curved, then stopped, widening into a small chamber right before a heavily reinforced foundation wall. The escape was never meant to succeed. The digging stopped at the exact point where discovery was guaranteed. The message was crystal clear: we can get this far. We can reach this point anytime we choose. Everything in op. Investigators finally saw the operation for what it was. This wasn't an escape attempt. It was a controlled confrontation, a challenge to the system itself. And the missing inmate? He wasn't gone because he'd escaped. He was gone because he had become a piece of evidence. The moment the tunnel was found, he was whisked away under heavy guard, hidden from the general population to prevent him from becoming a martyr or a target for retaliation. The prison had quietly and efficiently corrected its most dangerous vulnerability while the rest of the world, and even the rest of the prison, was focused on the internal investigation. As night fell on the fourth day, an eerie calm settled over the cell blocks. The lockdown was still in effect, but the tension had changed. The tattooed inmates lay on their bunks, staring at ceilings stained with the passage of time. They listened to the faint, distant hum of newly upgraded surveillance systems, a constant reminder that they were being watched more closely than ever. The guards, too, were different. They paused longer at each cell door, their eyes searching, no longer taking compliance for granted. The fundamental trust between keeper and kept, however fragile it had been, was now permanently broken. The truth was finally out in the open, but it came with a heavy price. The administration of Angola Prison had learned a sobering lesson. Even here, on death row, where sentences are absolute, and freedom is just a ghost, the human will to be heard will always find a way. It will carve its message into concrete and steel if it has to. As the investigators prepared to close the case, one question hung in the air, a question with no easy answer. What would happen the next time? The next time regret and the desperate need for agency decided to speak again. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into the world's most incredible stories. The final phase began quietly, the way all irreversible moments do inside a high-security prison. There were no sirens this time, no alarms cutting through the night. Angola Prison moved with a deliberate calm, its machinery turning inward to seal what had been exposed. The case was no longer about a tunnel or a missing inmate. It was about containment, of truth, of consequences, of regret that had finally run out of places to hide. Before dawn, selected cells were opened under a full guard presence. Inmates with tattooed arms stepped out one by one, their wrists cuffed, their eyes fixed forward. There was no resistance, no words exchanged. Each man understood that the moment for quiet defiance had passed. Prison guards escorted them through corridors washed in cold blue light, past cameras that now tracked every movement with renewed vigilance. This wasn't punishment disguised as order, it was resolution. Interrogations resumed for the last time. One inmate, his chest covered in overlapping tattoos that told a fragmented story of loyalty and loss, sat under fluorescent lights. He finally spoke without calculation. He admitted the tunnel had been his idea, born not from the hope of freedom, but from an unbearable stillness. Years on death row had taught him that time didn't heal. It pressed inward, crushing you slowly. The tunnel was a way to feel movement again, to prove that even under a death sentence, action was still possible. His voice cracked, not with fear of the consequences, but with exhaustion. Regret had become heavier than concrete. Another inmate, younger, the ink still sharp on his neck and hands, confessed to relaying messages. He said he believed he was part of something larger than himself. The plan gave him purpose, something to wake up for beyond execution dates and legal appeals that never came. When the investigators asked if it was worth it, he didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. The missing inmate from cell D-17 was formally accounted for in sealed documentation. He was alive, held in solitary confinement under strict surveillance. He was removed from death row, not as a reward, but as a necessity. The prison understood the danger of symbols. Letting him remain visible among the others would have turned him into a martyr, a legend. Instead, he became an absence, an unspoken warning etched into the institution's memory. Administrative findings followed swiftly. Procedures were rewritten. Surveillance systems were upgraded. Guard rotations were restructured to eliminate any predictability. The administrator who approved the unauthorized transfer that kicked this all off was disciplined quietly, a tacit acknowledgement that the failure had come from familiarity, from a moment of carelessness, rather than malice. Angola Prison closed ranks, not defensively, but with the heavy understanding that no system, no matter how secure, is immune to erosion from within. Life on death row resumed its rigid rhythm. The tattooed inmates returned to their cells, some quieter than before, others visibly hollowed out. Conversations dwindled to nothing. Eyes no longer searched for hidden signals in the hallways. The tunnel was sealed, filled with concrete thicker than the walls it had once challenged. Its existence would never be acknowledged publicly, but inside those walls, it became a whispered legend, a stark reminder that defiance has its limits, and those limits are enforced without spectacle. Guards noticed the subtle changes. Men who once pressed against their cell bars, hungry for any interaction, now sat back on their bunks, withdrawn. The night rounds passed without the usual whispered exchanges between cells. The solitary confinement units emptied slowly, releasing inmates who were altered by the intense isolation, stripped of illusions they hadn't even known they were carrying. Regret settled differently now. It was less explosive, more permanent, like a stain that could never be washed out. The official investigation closed without headlines. No escape had occurred. No riot had erupted. From the outside, Angola Prison remained what it had always been, a place of final sentences and long, dark shadows. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. Authority had been tested and brutally reaffirmed. Hope, that dangerous and fleeting emotion, had flared briefly and then burned out completely, leaving only a cold, hard clarity in its wake. And on death row, clarity is its own kind of punishment. As the blue-toned lights dimmed for the night, the men inside their cells lay awake, staring at ceilings they knew too well. Each one carried his own crime, his own moment that could never be undone. One act, one decision, had led to a lifetime of regret. A film playing on repeat in the quiet hours when there was nothing left to distract the mind from the truth. If this prison case stunned you, the next one will be even darker. Subscribe so you don't miss it.